Colin Bennett's life was simple, if not a little mundane. He worked as a room attendant at the Karl Montevista Hotel, an establishment known for its luxury and exclusivity. Every day was the same: cleaning rooms, handling guests' requests, and making sure not to cross paths with Karl Montevista, the aloof and formidable CEO of the Montevista Group. Karl Montevista was a man of power and prestige. At 32, he had taken his family's empire to new heights, earning him the reputation of a business genius. But Karl was also known for his cold demeanor and disinterest in forming personal connections. He treated everyone as though they were merely chess pieces in his grand game of life. Colin had admired Karl from afar, though not in the way the other employees did. While others fawned over his good looks and commanding presence, Colin saw the loneliness in his eyes. But Colin knew better than to get involved. He had enough on his plate, juggling long shifts and financial struggles to support his family. Everything changed one fateful evening. Colin had just finished his shift when he overheard a heated argument coming from the hotel's VIP lounge. Curious, he peeked inside and saw Karl speaking to an older man. His father, no doubt. "You need a fiancée, Karl," the older man said sternly. "This bachelor lifestyle of yours is unacceptable. The board is questioning your commitment to family values. Without a solid personal life, our reputation and the company could suffer." "I don't have time for this, father," Karl replied, his voice icy. "I'm running a business, not playing house." As the argument escalated, Colin tried to slip away unnoticed, but fate had other plans. Karl's father spotted him and immediately called him over. "You there? What's your name?" Colin froze. "See Colin, sir." The older man studied him for a moment before turning to Karl. "Why not him?" Karl's sharp gaze landed on Colin, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "You can't be serious," Karl said, his tone laced with disbelief. "Think about it," his father insisted. "He's already here, and no one will suspect anything. It's perfect." Before Colin could protest, Karl sighed in exasperation. "Fine, but this is strictly business," he said, glaring at Colin. "Do you understand?" Colin nodded hesitantly, unsure of what he had just agreed to. The next day, Colin found himself sitting across from Karl in the CEO's opulent office. The room was a stark contrast to Colin's modest existence. Sleek leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a desk that probably cost more than Colin made in a year. "This arrangement benefits both of us," Karl began, his tone brisk. "You'll act as my fiancée until the board's concerns are alleviated. In return, I'll compensate you generously." Colin's head spun. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Karl leaned back in his chair, studying Colin with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Besides, you have a certain simplicity that makes this believable." Colin bristled at the backhanded compliment, but held his tongue. He couldn't afford to lose this opportunity, no matter how degrading it felt. "Fine," Colin said reluctantly, "but I have conditions. No invading my personal life, and we keep this strictly professional." Karl smirked, clearly amused by Colin's attempt to assert control. "Agreed. But remember, you're playing my fiancée now. Act the part." The next few days were a whirlwind. Colin was thrust into a world of designer clothes, lavish dinners, and public appearances. Karl coached him on everything: how to smile for the cameras, what to say to the press, and even how to hold his hand in public. Despite the tension between them, there were moments of unexpected camaraderie. During a particularly grueling photo shoot, Colin made an offhand comment about how ridiculous it all was, and to his surprise, Karl chuckled. It was the first time Colin had seen him genuinely smile, and it stirred something within him. The first major test of their arrangement came in the form of a charity gala. Colin felt completely out of his depth as he walked into the grand ballroom, his hand clasped tightly in Karl's. The room was filled with the city's elite, powerful businessmen, socialites, and celebrities. "Just stick close to me," Karl murmured, his voice low and reassuring. Colin nodded, though his nerves were threatening to get the better of him. He felt the weight of 100 eyes on him as they made their way through the crowd. Karl was a natural, effortlessly charming everyone he spoke to. Colin, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. He stumbled over his words when someone asked him about his relationship with Karl, earning a sharp look from his supposed fiancée. "Relax," Karl said under his breath, squeezing Colin's hand. "You're doing fine." The highlight of the evening came when Karl was asked to give a speech. As he spoke about the importance of philanthropy, Colin couldn't help but admire him. He was confident, articulate, and commanding, a man who seemed born to lead. But as the night wore on, Colin began to see another side of Karl. During a quiet moment on the balcony, away from the prying eyes of the crowd, Karl let his guard down. "This is exhausting," he admitted, loosening his tie. Colin glanced at him, surprised. "You seem to handle it so well." Karl sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's all an act. People don't care about the real me. They just want the CEO, the image. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would still care if I wasn't this." Colin didn't know what to say. For the first time, he saw Karl not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man burdened by expectations. That night, as they returned to the hotel, Colin couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Karl than he let on. And as much as he tried to deny it, he found himself wanting to know the man behind the mask. Colin adjusted the hem of his designer suit as he entered the Montevista hotel lobby, now walking in Karl's shadow as if he belonged in his world. The aftermath of the charity gala left him buzzing with mixed emotions. On the one hand, he felt the pressure of keeping up appearances. On the other, Karl's vulnerability on the balcony haunted him. For the first time, Colin wondered if he'd misjudged the cold, commanding CEO. "Focus," Karl instructed as they headed to a private meeting room. "The media will dissect every detail, so no slip-ups." "I get it," Colin replied, though the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. He was still grappling with the idea of playing someone's fiancée. The situation felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake from. Inside the meeting room, a PR team awaited them. A tall woman with sharp features, Amara, the head of public relations, immediately approached them with a clipboard. "The feedback from last night's gala has been overwhelmingly positive," she began, her tone brisk. "Your speech, Mr. Montevista, was lauded, and the photos of you two together were well received. However," she paused, glancing at Colin. "However?" Karl prompted, his tone impatient. "There's skepticism about your relationship's authenticity," Amara admitted. "Some have noted Colin's discomfort in social settings. If you want this ruse to succeed, we need to make the connection seem more natural." Karl's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "What's your plan?" "We need candid moments," Amara explained. "Real interactions outside of formal events, dates, casual outings. The media needs to see you as a genuine couple." Colin's stomach churned. The idea of spending more time with Karl outside the public was both thrilling and terrifying. "Fine," Karl agreed, his voice curt. He turned to Colin. "We'll start tomorrow. Be ready." The next morning, Colin stood in front of his small apartment mirror, trying to calm his nerves. Karl had arranged for a casual date at a nearby park, and while the outing was purely for appearances, Colin couldn't help but feel anxious. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Karl stood there, looking effortlessly handsome even in a casual button-up and jeans. Colin felt underdressed in comparison, despite his attempt to look presentable. "You're late," Karl remarked, though there was no real irritation in his voice. Colin rolled his eyes. "You're early." They walked to the car together, where a sleek black SUV awaited them. Colin tried to ignore the way Karl's hand brushed against his as they got inside. The park was bustling with families and couples, a stark contrast to the sterile world of boardrooms and luxury hotels. Amara's team discreetly trailed them, snapping photos from a distance as Colin and Karl strolled through the greenery. "You're stiff," Karl said, breaking the silence. "Maybe because I'm not used to this," Colin shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. Karl smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching. Relax. Pretend you're actually enjoying yourself. Colin sighed, forcing a smile as they stopped by a food cart. Karl ordered 2 ice creams, handing one to Colin. The unexpected gesture caught Colin off guard. "Thanks," he muttered, his cheeks flushing. As they walked, Karl began to share stories about his childhood, a rare glimpse into the man beneath the CEO facade. Colin listened intently, surprised by how relatable Karl seemed in those moments. "You're different than I thought," Colin admitted after a pause. Karl raised an eyebrow. "And what did you think?" "That you were an unapproachable, heartless jerk," Colin said with a teasing grin. Karl chuckled, a genuine laugh that made Colin's heart skip a beat. "Fair enough. But don't let it get to your head. I'm still your boss." The park outing was a success, judging by the positive coverage in the media. Photos of Karl and Colin laughing and sharing ice cream went viral, with captions praising their genuine connection. But behind closed doors, the lines between their fake relationship and reality began to blur. One evening, Karl invited Colin to his penthouse for dinner. Colin hesitated at first, unsure of Karl's intentions, but eventually agreed. When he arrived, he was surprised to find Karl in the kitchen, wearing an apron and preparing a meal. "You cook?" Colin asked, incredulous. Karl shrugged. "I find it relaxing. Don't expect anything fancy, though." The meal was simple but delicious, pasta with a side of garlic bread. As they ate, Colin found himself relaxing in Karl's presence. The tension that usually accompanied their interactions was replaced by a comfortable silence. "You've surprised me," Colin admitted, sipping his wine. Karl smirked. "I have that effect on people." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Karl poured them both another glass of wine. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: favorite movies, childhood memories, and dreams for the future. "You're not what I expected either," Karl said, his tone softer than usual. Colin raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "Someone who would just go along with everything," Karl replied. "But you challenge me. It's refreshing." Colin's heart raced at the admission. He didn't know if it was the wine or the atmosphere, but he felt a connection to Karl he couldn't ignore. As the evening wore on, Colin couldn't help but wonder if their arrangement was becoming more than just a business deal. And judging by the way Karl looked at him, he wasn't the only one questioning where their relationship was headed. The days following their date at the park were a whirlwind of media frenzy and tightly scheduled appearances. Colin was becoming accustomed to playing the role of Karl Montevista's fiancée, but his heart was far from prepared for the emotional undercurrents that followed. "Another charity gala tomorrow night," Amara announced during a brief meeting in Karl's office. "This time, the stakes are higher. We're expecting international press coverage." Colin's chest tightened at the thought of being scrutinized on such a grand scale. "Can't we keep this low-key for once?" he asked, glancing at Karl. Karl smirked but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying Colin with a mix of amusement and something else Colin couldn't place. "Low-key doesn't exist in my world," Karl finally said. "You'll be fine." His words were meant to be reassuring, but Colin couldn't shake his unease. That evening, Colin found himself in his modest apartment, staring at the dress shoes Karl had gifted him for their first event. They were polished to perfection, a stark contrast to the scuffed sneakers he usually wore. He sighed, picking up the phone to call his best friend, Jenna. "Still alive?" Jenna teased the moment she answered. "Barely," Colin replied, flopping onto his couch. "This whole thing is exhausting." Jenna's tone softened. "Are you sure you're not in over your head?" Colin hesitated. He couldn't deny the growing feelings he had for Karl, but admitting it out loud felt too risky. "It's just a job, Jen. Nothing more." "If you say so," Jenna replied, though her voice was laced with doubt. The charity gala was held in a grand ballroom, the kind Colin had only ever seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the room buzzed with the chatter of wealthy elites. "Relax," Karl murmured as they entered. His hand rested lightly on Colin's lower back, a touch that felt both grounding and electrifying. Colin forced a smile, his heart pounding as cameras flashed in their direction. Karl's confidence was magnetic, and Colin found himself leaning into his presence for support. They mingled with guests, Karl's charm on full display. Colin marveled at how effortlessly Karl commanded attention, his words smooth and calculated. "You're doing great," Karl whispered during a brief moment alone. Colin's cheeks warmed. "Thanks. I just hope I don't trip or say something stupid." Karl chuckled, the sound low and intimate. "You won't. I've got you." As the evening progressed, Colin found himself loosening up. The champagne helped, but it was Karl's unwavering presence that truly calmed his nerves. "Come with me," Karl said suddenly, taking Colin's hand and leading him to a quieter corner of the ballroom. "What are we doing?" Colin asked, his pulse quickening at the touch of Karl's hand. Karl didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to face Colin, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "I wanted to thank you," he said. Colin blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For putting up with all of this," Karl replied, gesturing vaguely to the glittering room around them. "I know it's not easy, but you're handling it better than I expected." Colin laughed, the sound tinged with disbelief. "You're thanking me? I thought you'd be more likely to criticize me." "For not being perfect." Karl's lips twitched into a small smile. "You're more perfect than you realize." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Colin's heart raced, his mind scrambling to process what Karl had just said. Before he could respond, a waiter approached with a tray of champagne. Karl took 2 glasses, handing one to Colin. "To surviving another gala," Karl said, raising his glass. Colin smiled, clinking his glass against Karl's. "To not tripping over my own feet." They both laughed, the tension between them easing but not disappearing entirely. The ride back to Karl's penthouse was quiet, but the air between them was charged. Colin stared out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and longing. "You're quiet," Karl observed, breaking the silence. "Just tired," Colin replied, though it was only half true. Karl didn't press further, but his gaze lingered on Colin longer than necessary. When they arrived, Karl poured them both a glass of wine and settled on the couch beside Colin. The city lights twinkled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over the room. "You've been doing this for years," Colin said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The public appearances, the business meetings, the constant scrutiny. Doesn't it ever get exhausting?" Karl shrugged, swirling the wine in his glass. "It's all I've ever known. But yeah, sometimes it feels hollow." Colin frowned, surprised by the admission. "Then why keep doing it?" Karl's gaze shifted to the window. "Because it's expected of me. People rely on me, and I can't let them down." The vulnerability in Karl's voice made Colin's chest ache. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on Karl's arm. "You don't have to do it alone," Colin said softly. Karl turned to him, his eyes searching Colin's face. For a moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. "Colin," Karl began, his voice low and filled with something Colin couldn't quite decipher. But before Karl could say anything more, Colin pulled away, suddenly overwhelmed. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. Karl's expression flickered with disappointment, but he didn't stop him. "Good night, Colin." As Colin left the penthouse, his heart felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved feelings. He didn't know what was happening between him and Karl, but one thing was certain: their arrangement was no longer just business. Colin's departure from Karl's penthouse left a silence in its wake that even the hum of the city lights couldn't fill. Karl sat on the couch, staring at the empty wine glass in his hand. The vulnerability he'd shown Colin was unlike him, and the way Colin had looked at him, concerned, understanding, lingered in his mind. Across town, Colin lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His emotions were a tangled mess of confusion, guilt, and longing. The lines between their fake relationship and something deeper were blurring, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. The next morning, Colin resolved to focus on the professional side of their arrangement. He dressed simply, intending to keep a low profile at the hotel, but his heart sank when he saw Karl waiting for him in the lobby. "Good morning," Karl greeted, his tone neutral but his eyes searching. "Morning," Colin replied, forcing a smile. "I have meetings all day," Karl said, "but there's a charity luncheon tomorrow. I'll need you by my side." Colin nodded, his chest tightening. "Of course." Karl hesitated, as though he wanted to say more, but he simply nodded and left. The luncheon was held in a sprawling garden, the air filled with the scent of flowers and soft classical music. Colin wore a tailored suit Karl had arranged for him, feeling both awkward and oddly confident. "You look incredible," Karl murmured as they stepped out of the car. Colin's cheeks flushed, but he forced himself to focus. They were here to maintain the charade, nothing more. As they mingled with the guests, Colin couldn't help but notice the way Karl's hand lingered on his lower back or how his gaze softened whenever he looked at him. It was unsettling, but not unpleasant. During the luncheon, a prominent businesswoman approached them. "Karl," she said with a dazzling smile, "and this must be the fiancée I've heard so much about." Colin tensed but quickly plastered on a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The woman's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "How did you two meet?" Karl didn't miss a beat. "It was fate," he said smoothly. "I saw him, and I just knew." Colin's heart skipped a beat at Karl's words, even though he knew they were part of the act. Later, as they left the luncheon, Colin couldn't resist asking, "Do you always lie so convincingly?" Karl smirked but didn't answer immediately. Sometimes the best lies have a kernel of truth. Colin's breath caught, but before he could respond, Karl opened the car door for him, ending the conversation. That evening, Karl invited Colin to dinner at his penthouse. Colin hesitated but ultimately agreed, feeling a strange pull he couldn't ignore. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the city skyline their backdrop. "You're quiet tonight," Karl observed. "I'm just tired," Colin said, though it wasn't the full truth. Karl studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." Colin blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You're genuine," Karl said simply. "Everyone else in my life has an agenda, but you're different." Colin's chest tightened. "I'm not as noble as you think," he said softly. Karl reached across the table, his hand brushing against Colin's. "I think you're exactly what I've been looking for." The moment was charged with unspoken emotions, and Colin found himself unable to look away. But before either of them could act on the tension, Karl's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. "It's work," Karl said, his tone apologetic. Colin nodded, forcing a smile. "Go ahead. I should head home anyway." As Karl escorted Colin to the door, he hesitated. "Colin, Colin looked up at him, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Karl shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Nothing. Good night." "Good night," Colin replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left, Colin couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just shifted between them. Colin returned home that evening, but his mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Karl. The boundary between their arranged relationship and something deeper was becoming increasingly blurred, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his emotions in check. The next few days were filled with quiet tension. At the hotel, Karl's presence was impossible to ignore. His eyes always seemed to find Colin, even in a crowded room. Conversations were brief, but layered with subtext that neither dared to address openly. One afternoon, as they rode the elevator together, the silence was suffocating. Colin stood by the door, his palms slightly sweaty as Karl leaned casually against the wall. "You don't like silence, do you?" Karl finally broke the quiet, a smirk playing on his lips. No, Colin admitted, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Do you? Karl's gaze softened. Sometimes, but not with you. Colin swallowed hard. You're impossible. Karl chuckled. Maybe, but you're intriguing. The elevator reached their floor, and Colin stepped out, walking briskly down the hallway to his room. The door closed behind him with a sharp click, but the memory of Karl's gaze lingered. The following evening, Colin was cleaning rooms when Karl found him in one of the suites. His presence was abrupt, commanding, and once again, unsettling. Colin, Karl said, his voice low, pulling him into a more private corner of the room. I need to talk to you. What is it? Colin asked cautiously, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Karl took a deep breath. I know this isn't easy for you. For either of us. Colin shifted, uncomfortable under Karl's intense gaze. It doesn't have to be anything more than what it is. Karl reached out, his fingers brushing against Colin's arm. Maybe it doesn't, but I want to know you. Truly. His eyes searched Colin's. Please. Colin's breath hitched. The weight of Karl's words pressed down on him, and for a moment, he felt powerless to resist. Karl, this isn't real. Karl's lips pressed into a firm line, but his eyes held something deeper. You don't have to pretend with me. Colin was quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. The line between reality and pretense had blurred too much. You don't know me, he whispered. I want to, Karl said. Give me a chance. The moment stretched into silence, and Colin could feel his own defenses crumbling. He looked away, unable to meet Karl's gaze any longer. Days later, Karl found Colin sitting alone in the hotel's lounge, lost in thought. The tension between them had only grown heavier, and Karl could no longer ignore it. He sat across from Colin, his presence commanding yet gentle. Colin, he said softly, what are you thinking? Colin glanced up, his expression unreadable. You know what I'm thinking. We shouldn't be doing this. Karl leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Why not? We both feel it, don't we? I don't know what I feel, Colin admitted, his voice trembling slightly. You're my boss. This isn't supposed to happen. Karl's eyes softened. I'm not just your boss, Colin. I'm something more. At least, I want to be. Colin's heart ached, torn between the pull of Karl's honesty and the harsh reality of their circumstances. You're just playing a role, aren't you? No, Karl said firmly. This is real for me. Maybe not everything, but parts of it. And I need you to see that. Colin sighed, his shoulders slumping. I don't know if I can. Give me a chance, Karl whispered again, his voice pleading. Colin closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For tonight, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For just tonight. Karl smiled softly, reaching across the table to gently squeeze Colin's hand. That's all I ask. That night, Colin and Karl returned to Karl's penthouse. The air was heavy with unspoken emotions, but for the first time, there was an understanding that lingered between them. Colin followed Karl silently, unsure of what to expect, but unable to deny the pull toward him. As they settled into the spacious living room, Karl poured them both a glass of wine. The room was dimly lit, casting a warm glow that highlighted the tension between them. Tell me something, Karl began softly, setting his glass down. Tell me what you want. Not as my fiancée, not as an employee. Just you. Colin took a slow sip of wine, his fingers resting on the glass. I don't know what I want, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm used to living in the background. I clean. I serve. I pretend. That's been my life. Karl moved closer, sitting beside him on the couch. But you're more than that, Colin. You don't have to pretend with me. Colin exhaled, his breath shaky. Sometimes it feels easier to stay where I'm needed, where people expect nothing of me. But that's not enough, Karl said, his voice steady. You deserve more. You deserve to be known for who you are. Colin shifted uncomfortably, a pang of vulnerability stirring within him. "I don't know how to be anything else," he confessed. Karl's fingers brushed gently against Colin's hand. "Then let me show you." Colin glanced at him, their eyes locking in a moment filled with unspoken desires. The intensity between them was overwhelming, but for once, it wasn't suffocating. It was freeing. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire in the corner adding warmth to the room. Colin felt his defenses slowly slipping away. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly feel. In the days following that night, the walls between them began to crumble. Colin no longer feared Karl's gaze or his touch. Instead, he found comfort in them. Their conversations were deeper, the silence between them no longer heavy but filled with understanding. One afternoon, as they walked through a nearby park, Karl stopped suddenly, turning to face Colin under the shade of a large oak tree. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a gentle glow on their faces. "I want to show you something," Karl said, his voice soft but firm. Colin raised an eyebrow. "What?" Karl reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple key. "This is your key to my penthouse. You don't have to ask, you don't have to pretend. It's yours." Colin's breath hitched, and for a moment, he simply stared at the key in Karl's hand. His emotions were a whirlwind: gratitude, fear, and overwhelming affection. "Karl." "You don't have to say anything," Karl said, sensing the flood of feelings. "It's yours." Tears welled in Colin's eyes, and he couldn't hold back the emotions any longer. He wrapped his arms around Karl, the warmth of his embrace grounding him. "Thank you," Colin whispered against Karl's chest. Karl tightened his hold, his lips brushing lightly against Colin's hair. "You're welcome." Despite their moments of intimacy and understanding, reality wasn't far from catching up. The media continued to report on their engagement, painting a picture that wasn't entirely false, yet not entirely true either. Colin felt the weight of expectations mounting once again. One evening, as they returned to the penthouse after a long day, Colin sat in the living room while Karl moved about, checking his phone and preparing for a meeting. "Karl," Colin began quietly, his voice hesitant, "what happens when this is over? When everything returns to normal?" Karl paused, his fingers stilling on the edge of the table. He turned to face Colin, his expression serious. "It doesn't have to end." "But it will," Colin said softly. "You'll go back to your life, and I'll go back to mine." Karl approached slowly, kneeling before Colin, his hands taking Colin's. "Not if we don't let it." Colin shook his head. "You can't change who you are, and neither can I." "I can," Karl said with conviction. "We can do this together." "I'm scared, Karl," Colin admitted, his voice breaking, "scared that I'll get lost in all of this, that when everything is over, I'll be nothing again." "You're not nothing," Karl insisted firmly. "You're everything, and I'll make sure you never forget that." The weight of Karl's words settled over Colin, comforting and unnerving all at once. He closed his eyes, finding solace in Karl's warmth, knowing that no matter what came next, for now, they had each other. Days turned into weeks, and the deeper they grew into their shared reality, the more complicated things became. Media coverage of Karl and Colin's engagement continued, but the dynamic between them was far more personal than the superficial headlines suggested. One evening, as they sat in the penthouse, the silence was broken by Karl's voice. "Colin, we need to talk." Colin turned to him, his heart immediately tightening. "About what?" "Us," Karl said simply. "About where we're heading." Colin felt his breath hitch. "I don't know if I'm ready for this conversation." Karl reached for Colin's hand, intertwining their fingers. "That's okay. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. I just want you to know that no matter what, I'm not going anywhere." "I want to believe you," Colin whispered, his voice shaking. "But things are so complicated." "I know," Karl said softly, "and it's okay to be scared. But we have something real, Colin, and I'll protect it." Colin stared at him, the weight of Karl's words sinking in. He didn't have all the answers, but the sincerity in Karl's gaze made him feel less alone in his uncertainty. The walls between them began to blur, but new revelations surfaced as old fears resurfaced. Colin found himself navigating uncharted emotions, uncertain of how much of his heart he could afford to give. One afternoon, after a late meeting, Karl returned home to find Colin sitting by the window, staring into the distance. "Colin," Karl said quietly, sitting beside him, "what's on your mind?" Colin hesitated, playing with the edge of his shirt. "There's something I haven't told you." Karl leaned in, concerned. "What is it?" Colin took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "My name isn't Colin." Karl's brows furrowed in confusion. "What?" "My real name was Mia," Colin admitted, his voice barely audible. "Before I started working here, I changed my name. I thought it would be easier." Karl didn't speak immediately. His silence felt heavy, but not in a way that Colin feared. It was thoughtful, as if he was processing what Colin had just revealed. "Mia," Karl said finally, his voice soft, "why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I didn't know how," Colin admitted, his voice breaking. "It's been part of me for so long. I didn't know if you'd accept who I truly am." Karl gently cupped Colin's cheek, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You think I care about a name? I care about you. Mia or Colin, it doesn't change who you are." Tears rolled down Colin's cheeks, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. The revelation of his true identity marked a turning point in their relationship. While there were still fears and uncertainties, Karl and Colin began to build something more substantial. The superficial boundaries that once defined their dynamic faded away, and they started creating a space where vulnerability and trust could coexist. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Karl reached out to take Colin's hand. "You know," Karl said softly, "we don't have to pretend anymore. Not with each other." Colin looked down at their intertwined hands, his heart swelling with emotion. "You've always known the real me, haven't you?" Karl smiled, his gaze warm and genuine. "From the moment I saw you. And you've known me too. Beneath the CEO facade, I'm just a man who wants to be understood." For the first time, Colin felt that the walls had completely come down. No more masks, no more lies. Just two people, bound together by honesty and love. "Maybe," Colin said, a small smile playing on his lips, "we can figure this out together." "Always," Karl said, his voice steady and unwavering. As the night deepened and their hearts grew closer, both knew that no storm could break what they had built, a bond forged in truth, trust, and unconditional love. As days passed, Colin and Karl continued to navigate their relationship with newfound clarity and understanding. Despite the complexities of their past and present, they found moments of peace in each other's company. Karl, though still managing his responsibilities as CEO, made a conscious effort to prioritize Colin and their relationship. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet park near Karl's penthouse, Karl stopped and turned to Colin. "I want to show you something." Curious, Colin followed Karl's lead until they reached a small, secluded spot under a large oak tree. Karl settled on a bench and patted the space beside him. "Do you remember what you said before?" Karl asked, his voice gentle. Colin frowned slightly in thought, then remembered. "That I didn't want to be just part of a fantasy. That I didn't want to be your pretend fiancé." Karl smiled softly, a nostalgic look in his eyes. "And here we are, in a place that belongs to neither fantasy nor reality. This is where I wanted to show you something real." Colin sat beside him, his heart softening. "What is it?" "It's a place where you can be just Colin. Not Mia, not my fiancé, not anyone else. Just you." Karl's gaze was tender, and his voice was calm. "No masks, no expectations. Just who you are." Colin felt a lump in his throat as his eyes welled with tears. He leaned into Karl's embrace, feeling the warmth of his presence envelop him. For the first time, he truly felt free. However, not all moments were serene. Memories of Colin's past continued to haunt him, and doubts began to creep in. Late one evening, Karl returned from a business meeting to find Colin sitting on the floor of their shared living space, his head in his hands. "Colin?" Karl called softly. Colin didn't respond right away. He looked up with weary eyes, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can do this." "Do what?" Karl asked, kneeling beside him. "Let go," Colin admitted. "Let go of everything that has built up inside me, of the pain, the fear. I thought changing my name would help, but it didn't. It just masked it." Karl took his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to let go of everything at once. We'll face it together." "But what if I'm not strong enough?" Colin whispered, his voice breaking. "You're strong enough because you have me," Karl said firmly. "And no matter how long it takes, we'll fight those demons side by side." Months turned into a year, and the connection between Karl and Colin grew deeper. With every challenge they overcame, their bond became even more resilient. They shared moments of laughter, sadness, and even anger, but through it all, their love was unwavering. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in their kitchen, Colin leaned back against Karl, a content smile on his face. "You really didn't need to do all of this for me." "I wanted to," Karl responded softly, kissing the top of his head. "Every piece of you matters to me, even the smallest things." Colin turned in his arms, his eyes sparkling. "You've shown me what it's like to truly be seen, and now I want to give you the same in return." Karl gazed into his eyes, his voice filled with emotion. "You don't have to give me anything. You've already given me everything by being yourself." Together, they shared a tender kiss, their love wrapped in sincerity and trust. In that moment, it felt like nothing else mattered, just them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Karl and Colin sat on their balcony. The city lights twinkled in the distance, creating a picturesque scene of beauty and calm. Karl leaned against the railing, his arm draped casually around Colin's shoulders. "Do you remember when I told you I wanted to know everything about you?" Karl murmured, breaking the silence. Colin smiled, his heart full. "How could I forget?" "I meant it then," Karl said, his voice steady. "But more than knowing, I want to experience everything with you. Every high and low, every joy and sorrow." Colin turned toward him, his eyes shimmering. "You're stuck with me." "Good," Karl said softly, pulling him closer, "because I wouldn't want it any other way." One evening, Karl knelt down on one knee in their living room, holding a small, elegant box. Colin gasped softly, tears streaming down his face as he recognized what was happening. "Colin," Karl said, his voice gentle but firm, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were more than just a name or a role. You are my heart, my everything. Will you marry me?" Colin couldn't speak. His breath hitched as emotions swelled inside him. With a nod, he embraced Karl tightly, tears pouring freely. "Yes," Colin whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes, Karl, forever." In that moment, a promise was made, a promise of a love that would stand the test of time. Through ups and downs, through the challenges and the triumphs, they knew they had found their forever. The CEO's fake fiancée became more than just a title. It became a story of true love, built on trust, authenticity, and the courage to be seen. And as they embraced their future, the world around them faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of their unwavering bond. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.